Good. Just say continue. Welcome to a discussion hosted by the International Association of Catholic Bioethics entitled Food for Thought, Human Health and the Sustainability of Food Systems. Let's begin with the advice of the Apostle James to his local community. He said, "If any of you lacks wisdom, he should ask God, who gives generously to all without finding fault, and wisdom will be given to him." Now, the next first thing I should say is that the webinar is being recorded. The introduction to the latest edition of Bioethics, an Anthology, edited by Udo Schuklenk and Peter Singer, begins thus. The term bioethics is often mistakenly ascribed to the biologist Van Rensselaer Potter, who used it in the 1970s to describe his proposal that we need an ethic that can incorporate our obligations not just to other human beings, but to the biosphere as a whole. However, an historically correct account should probably give credit for coining the term to Fritz Jahr, a German Protestant pastor who in 1927 published an article called Bioethics, a review of the ethical relationships of humans to animals and plants. Although the term is still occasionally used in the sense of an ecological ethic, it is now much more commonly used in the narrower sense of the study of ethical issues arising from the biological and medical sciences. End of quote. Today's discussion belongs to a series of webinars entitled Ecology, Health and Bioethics, and it's addressed to ethical issues in that older, wider sense, a review of the ethical relationships of humans not only to each other, as in the pandemic, but also to animals, plants, and the whole biosphere. In the first of the series, Henk ten Haver and Christina Ritchie outlined the reasons for and the importance of expanding the scope of our bioethical concerns to relationships among all participants of the Earth's ecosystem. Henk ten Haver and Christina Ritchie proposed that healthcare and bioethics should proceed from an understanding of our planet and its life forms as one ecosystem, for the health and well-being of everything in this ecosystem is interdependent. In our second webinar, Santiago Henao and Corey Labrecque opened up a series of questions about the relationships between human beings and other animals, in particular when it seems that the well-being of one species conflicts with that of another. That is, they explored the ethics of One Health approaches to health promotion and healthcare, focusing on the relationship between humans and animals. Well, in today's seminar, we turn our attention to ecological questions about plants, and in particular to the intersection of concerns about human health and the sustainability of systems of food production. We'll discuss one area of health promotion, how to produce, distribute, and consume food in ways that promote both a flourishing ecosystem and human health. Our discussion will be stimulated by our two presenters, who will examine two terms that were identified in our last webinar as needing further development: integral ecology and stewardship. Well, now our presenters are both John Cuddeback and John Berkman. Dr. John Cuddeback describes himself as a husband and father, a philosophy professor, a student of great thinkers, and a man on a search. He teaches philosophy at Christendom College, Virginia in the States, and is a board member of Catholic Rural Life. He started an online community called Lifecraft, which aims to blend philosophical wisdom and practical action. One of John's publications is entitled Reflections of a Green Thomist on Pope Francis's Laudato Si. Now, the other John is John Berkman, is also a husband and father. He's a moral theologian and full professor at Regis College and the Toronto School of Theology at the University of Toronto. John's currently on a year's sabbatical leave at Campion Hall in Oxford, although he's actually in Wales at the moment, but he's at Oxford to do research on ecology and on the moral philosophy of the great Catholic philosopher Elizabeth Anscombe. John's an avid biker and has been a vegetarian for many years. So our speakers will have about 15 to 20 minutes each to outline their argument. We will then offer them 5 minutes or so to engage directly with each other before we open the meeting to a wider discussion amongst the participants at the webinar. So at that point, I will hand over the proceedings to Bill Sullivan of the University of Toronto and Mary Kate Gorky of Georgetown University, who will explain how we manage the discussion from there. But first to our speakers, our two Johns, and I would ask you, John Cuddeback, first of all, to speak to us.
Would it be
Bernadette?
sorry,
I think, yeah, I think
please,
it
John,
is
hang.
going to be John Berkman who will be speaking first.
It's John Berkman who is first. Well, I do apologise to both the Johns, and now I invite John Berkman to open our proceedings. Thanks, John.
Certainly. All right. Is my screen being shared?
Not yet.
Okay. So I click on, oh, here we go. Perfect. All right. Well, thank you very much for welcoming me to be a part of this. It's a real pleasure and honor to be participating in this. I'm just sorry, got to move a few things on my screen here. Okay, perfect. I think Professor Cuddeback and I agreed to kind of divide things up, that I would take a more macro approach and he would take a more micro approach. So I'm going to give kind of an overview, very summary overview of thinking about one particular question on the interface of ecological thinking, particularly as discussed by Pope Francis in Laudato Si, reflection about other creatures, and also thinking about human health in relation to bioethics. So I called my presentation Changing Human Diet, ? And by that I'm referring to two things. First is the reality of the ever-evolving diets of human beings, particularly in contemporary Western societies. I expect most of us, if we think about, for example, what we ate around the family table growing up, however many years ago, maybe it's not as true for those of you who are younger than I am, but over the years, my diet has changed rather radically, and not simply because at one point I became a vegetarian, but simply because culturally, diets are shifting quite radically. And the second thing, my title, Changing Human Diets, is what I consider to be a moral imperative for Catholics in the West to show moral leadership in changing our diets in ways called for in contemporary Catholic social teaching, and in particular, Pope Francis's encyclical Laudato Si. So I want to say just a few points about kind of my overview of what I think should be changing and why. So again, the big question I'm asking is why should Catholic bioethics be concerned with human dietary practices? And what I want to make a case for is that we do have an imperative of sorts as Catholics, and along with other people of goodwill, particularly in the West, to move, what I want to say in general, from what is known as a meat-based to a plant-based diet. So then I want to put it in the context of Pope Francis's Laudato Si. And what is central to Laudato Si is what Pope Francis refers to as an integral ecology. And I see three general categories in which he is calling us to both see things in new ways, and he very much emphasizes the importance of how we in fact see things, and to engage these questions of a new way of seeing our planet, sometimes called the environment, which he prefers to refer to as our common home. Secondly, he is also pointing to clearly a new way of seeing and interacting with other animal species with whom we share the planet. And finally, he also wants us to have new ways of seeing ourselves and our communities. And there are two important things. By integral ecology, he argues that proper care for our common home and the environment, and proper care for other species with which we share the planet, should in no way deprecate or relativize the fundamental concern which we show for human beings. In fact, I think we can see in Laudato Si that he in fact thinks all of these three things go together, that if we're to care for other human individuals and human communities properly, that will require us to change the way we think and see and engage the broader environment and other animal species. And what this notion of integral ecology is calling for is, I take this notion of integral flourishing, that for human beings, our calling is to flourish as the kind of creatures we are, that God has made us, and wants us to live out our lives well. This notion of flourishing can also be applied to other species, animal species, and also to ecosystems. And this is certainly a major concern of Pope Francis, the way certain kinds of human interactions in the environment are challenging and destroying certain ecosystems, as well as he refers to on a yearly basis, the disappearance of hundreds of different species of creatures, which he sees as hugely problematic. I take it that the problem that Pope Francis sees at the heart of the crisis are certain contemporary attitudes which lead to problematic actions. And these are both on an individual level, individual wrongdoing, but also what Catholic social teaching refers to as structural evil or social sin, where harmful, evil attitudes are very much built into certain kinds of social structures that can't simply be overcome by individual choices and actions. One of the two attitudes that I think is central in Laudato Si's diagnosis of the problem is what he refers to as a technological attitude, where it's a quest for mastery and power and control over everything, and also seeing other creatures, whether humans or non-human or the environment, at a kind of remote view of them, and not actual engagement in a kind of face-to-face or direct way with those other human beings and other species with which we live and interact. Secondly, he clearly thinks that a major part of the problem is also a certain kind of economic attitude, I think typically manifested, well, we might say most blatantly in a vice of greed, or in particular ways of pursuing wealth to the detriment of what he sees as the goods of integral flourishing of all creatures on this planet. So then let me move on to what I see is the end goal towards which he is talking about this new attitude that he thinks is necessary. Now, while the most common language for speaking about the environmental crisis, a move towards sustainability, and I think that sustainability is a good thing, but I don't think, at least in light of Laudato Si, that it's an adequate description of what Laudato Si is calling us to. And more specifically, with regard to human diets. The end goal is not merely sustainability, but a movement towards a new way of living that prioritizes this integral flourishing of human communities, of non-human animal communities, and of ecosystems more generally. One of the reasons I think it is different is what I take to be one of the most important things in Laudato Si is the emphasis that both the environment and other species of animals have intrinsic goodness. They are not simply to be understood as purely instrumental for human ends, but rather this new way of seeing requires us to recognize the independent and intrinsic goodness of God's created environment and these other species. That the rest of creation is also an expression of divine goodness that requires no ulterior justification for concern for it, but rather simply the fact that God creates it, God considers it good, and all other creatures in their very being, in their flourishing, praise God and give glory to God in living according to their natures. So the question then is, in light of this vision of Laudato Si, how do we rethink human dietary practices in a way that contributes to, or the increased possibility of the flourishing of all three of the environment, of other non-human animals, as well as human and human communities? And what I refer to this three kinds of flourishing is what I call integral ecological flourishing. Okay. So how do we discern what's involved with integral ecological flourishing? So certainly we can begin by looking to the Catholic tradition's understanding of and teaching regarding, for example, the natural law. And that is certainly an important place for beginning. And certainly when people try to understand a variety of different species, they look to try to understand their nature and so forth and how they flourish. What kind of activities are characteristic of different species. However, discerning the nature of the flourishing of all of creation is not, in light of Christian belief, straightforward because of the very fallenness of the world. Nature, as we currently experiences, is not identical to God's good creation. Thus, at every level of creaturely existence, something is in some way broken or degraded. And human beings should not expect to be able to overcome all of these degradations or brokenness, either with regard to human lives or with regard to the rest of the creation. Thus, efforts that we can make as human beings to improve integral ecological flourishing will be subject to limits, and thus should be gauged with humility. Very often, as Pope Francis points out, certain kinds of human interventions, which may be well-meaning and are thought to improve things, actually create a whole series of new environmental problems. And so there takes a real significant mode of discernment to think wisely about when human beings should intervene and in what ways to assist this integral ecological flourishing. So, health and diet, of which I can say relatively few things, but I will generalize from huge amounts of scientific literature that has been being written over the last 30 years or so. So our topic as bioethicists is human health. Now, in light of Laudato Si, perhaps we should rethink that. Can we speak of ecological health? However, as the case may be, I will focus on human health in this overview. So how might we think well about the service of human health in light of this broader vision of God's good creation, of integral ecological flourishing, while acknowledging its fallenness? So certainly one big area that should be, I hope is obvious to all of us, is the crisis of climate change. And for purposes of this presentation, I will presume that everyone agrees that climate change at the current rate is morally problematic for integral ecological flourishing. Thus, one of the things that I think Catholics should be committed to, because of all the problems that are going to result from such rapid change in our climate, is a moral commitment to the reduction of greenhouse gases. Secondly, in Laudato Si, Pope Francis, in thinking clearly about the intrinsic goodness of other species, and that it demands a fundamental reconsideration of our relationship with other animal species with whom we share the planet. We might say at the very beginning, at the very minimum, we should actively work to eliminate all animal cruelty, which is clearly, according to the Catechism and elsewhere, a sin against God. More generally, we should seek to undo, where possible, the various ways in which humans have and continue to contribute to the destruction of so many species. Laudato Si refers to hundreds disappearing every year, with whom we should be seeking rather to live with in peace and concord to the extent possible. Finally, and part of this again is the recovery of human flourishing. How might we reorder human priorities toward what constitutes authentic human flourishing, challenging societal goals and attitudes that undermine it? Now, in light of these more general moral imperatives, let's think about each of these three aspects that I just mentioned. So first, climate change. There are innumerable studies that demonstrate beyond any serious doubt that if we hope to significantly reduce greenhouse gases, one key element of that is moving toward more of a plant-based diet than a meat-based diet. That for a whole variety of reasons, that in general movement would make possible a huge reduction in greenhouse gases. Now, part of that, again, one of the problems with the animal-based diet or the meat-based diet for the human population, on one hand, it's because over the last 60 or so years, there's been a massive change in animal husbandry or animal agriculture, particularly in certain countries in the West, which have moved to what are called CAFOs, confined animal feeding operations, or more generally known as factory farms. These started in the US and Britain in the 1950s and gradually expanded throughout those countries and to other countries in the West, and are also being exported to developing nations. It is widely recognized that a meat-based diet, if it expands throughout the world, particularly in relation to factory farming, it will require enormous evils to be done to the environment and to non-human animals, and will likely exhaust the planet's capacities if human beings do so. Secondly, certainly, at least for the last 2 decades, innumerable scientific studies have been published that point to meat-based diets as generally consumed in the West are deleterious to human health and longevity, and more generally to human flourishing as an element of integral ecological flourishing. Thus, there has been a widespread suggestion that as society, we should move to more of a plant-based diet, not only for the flourishing of ecosystems and other species, but also for human flourishing. Now, I think it's important to add that this argument is a societal-based argument. We might say that it's possible for many individuals to have a strongly meat-based diet, and it could be compatible with human health and flourishing. The problem with meat-based diets on one level, or one kind of argument, is they're problematic because there's no way for these diets to become universal among human populations without an even greater destruction of the planet than is currently going on. Because relatively, only in developed countries and in developing countries where it's quickly expanding are meat-based diets functioning as dominant. And if they continue to broaden to more and more parts of the world, the environmental degradation will become much greater. So if we were to think about both in terms of, and I obviously have not raised a whole number of issues involved in animal agriculture, I mean, in terms of the pollution, in terms of problems of illnesses from consuming animal products, particularly with antibiotics and the lessening of antibiotic resistance among human communities when antibiotics are widespread used among domestic animals that we consume and so forth. There are many kinds of other issues, but let me just conclude briefly with a few challenges. So one of the challenges, I think, is clearly if you are going to undergo a significant societal transformation, and of course it will be different in different societies, very different, there are obviously going to be those who are going to suffer under any kind of change in the economic production, economic movements in a society. And also there will be cultural challenges. So we certainly certain kinds of industries that may be closely associated with certain cultures that are going to raise all kinds of problems. And certainly those human beings who are affected by their concerns and their worries and the economic challenges then will need to be addressed. A second question is, if we move to a plant-based diet or move away from certainly factory farming to better quality and better quality meats and better treated animals, will this cause food prices to rise? And there are a number of complex questions involved in that, and also in regard to that, about the incredible waste of food that goes on particularly in Western societies, and how we deal with those kinds of questions. And finally, one I think needs to particularly be aware of the kinds of arguments that I might well be interpreted as being giving, particularly if one interprets what I'm saying as kind of a planetary call that involves the kind of cultural imperialism from a very wealthy society, pointing towards societies that have not necessarily had the opportunities as those in more wealthy countries have, And for that reason, I would say the call of what I'm advocating is particularly incumbent upon those of us, particularly Catholics, in very affluent societies to take a lead in doing this and changing our lives and being very careful about the expectations or calls we have in societies that have not had all the benefits that we have had, and primarily moved by our own witnesses rather than by shrill cries directed to others. So I think I will leave it at that. Thank you.
John, thank you very much. Now, what am I trying to do? John, thank you very much for that. That was terrific. What a lovely set of challenges for us, in particular, the last one, to lead by example rather than by preaching. So we'll move now to our second John Cuddeback. Would you like to take up the issues, please, John?
Sure. Thank you. Thank you, Bernadette. And thank you, John Berkman, for a very stimulating, challenging presentation. Good presentation raises more questions than answers, I always find, which is exciting. That's part of the challenge of being rational animals. So there's much to talk about there. And I am gonna, start with a couple of very universal principles, and then make some more concrete suggestions, and whether similar, I think, to John and I think actually John Berkman and I are kind of parallel in many ways. And he said there was something too, as saying that he'd be more micro and I'd be, he'd be more macro and I'd be more micro, but in certain ways, he, in a lovely way, began with the universal principles, which is the way to begin, and then got very concrete. In a sense, I'm going to do the same thing, and we can then look at how we can weave that together into a discussion. I'm just struck. I want to begin by a little, if I may, a philosophical analysis of the notion of steward, and why I think that, may I put it this way, Christian environmentalists, Christian bioethicists are in a unique position in using the notion of steward, because I think we can go biblical here for a moment, looking at kind of the history of the notion of steward. Our Lord clearly had a predilection for using a concept of steward, which in the social economic situation of the New Testament referred particularly to a person that had a unique place in a household. And a steward was someone who had authority, but someone who has authority who's under authority. And I think that, therefore, in the notion of steward, just first of all, analyzing that notion, we can give a kind of analysis, a kind of definition of it, where we say a steward is someone who actually is primarily a servant, but he serves by exercising a kind of dominion or mastership. We see that there's a fundamental distinction between kind of one in authority versus one under authority. One in authority / we can use the term master, just taking that in a broad sense and removing from it any negative connotations. Master is the one who gives direction. A servant is one who receives direction. Seems to me that a steward is precisely something of a combination that's not just mixy, as though, well, steward is just kind of half and half. No, a steward is first of all a kind of servant. And the kind of servant he is calls him to exercise a certain kind of mastery. So he has a certain dominion. So how often does our Lord refer to the master going away or giving a certain direction, certain commands, certain responsibility to those he leaves behind? So those he leaves behind are, or whether he leaves or not, in that household, the steward in that household is one who is definitively under the master, yet he is under the master precisely in such a way that he needs to exercise a kind of mastery himself. Otherwise, he won't be being the good servant that he's called to be. I go back to where I opened. Christians are in a unique position where at root of all of our concern for the environment, for the natural world, for human life, for human health, is in a context, a very beautiful context, one that often those around us don't recognize as being the most beautiful context of all. Indeed, it's not just a beautiful context, it's true. That God is a creator, that God is a father, and that God has ordered things in such a way that he calls us, his human creatures, to be stewards in a very special kind of way. And so when we go about our thinking about how to exercise and the exercising of a kind of stewardship, and indeed, when I teach ethics, I say I think the notion of steward is in fact a fundamental notion for understanding ethics in general. For indeed, we are stewards in life, period. We are stewards inasmuch as we have been given the great dignity, the great vocation to be under the great master and father, loving God. And Laudato Si makes a great, I think very, very wonderfully, really emphasizes God as a father. At the root of the creative order is a father who cares, a father who loves us and is ordering and arranging all things for our good. Therefore, part of his ordering, and indeed central to it, is that our good, that our Father wants for us, is that we learn to be like him, which means exercising a kind of mastery, a kind of stewardship, a kind of giving of order. And this is the fundamental structure of the tradition's understanding of natural law. I particularly takes the teacher, St. Thomas Aquinas. He has a very beautiful notion of natural laws, of participation in the eternal law. And we participate, everything participates in the eternal law, in the view of Thomas Aquinas. But then rational creatures participate in an absolutely unique way. As he says, quote, by becoming provident, beautiful word. God, of course, is provident, but not God alone is provident. He calls us, indeed demands, that we take and receive his direction and make it be a foundation for how we live our life. So indeed, again, in the Christian view, which is rooted in a great philosophical tradition and very much in accord with it, is all of human life should be seen in terms of what is the fundamental ordering that we have received? Who are we? To what is our nature ordered? And so overseeing, guiding, and directing, and norming all of human life are certain objective principles that are written into reality. Many around us see this as a problem. Many around us see this as oppression. And I think at root, central to our call at this point is to try to enunciate the basic, very root principle: the truth will set you free. That indeed our dignity is in the calling to receive from God this ordering, this call to become provident for ourselves, putting order into our own lives. And here, frankly, is the foundation for all these things that we talk about need to begin with ourselves, because the first thing God calls us to do is put order in our own lives. What does it mean to talk about putting order into anything else, being concerned about anything around us, if we aren't first recognizing that it demands certain things of us morally? So the whole moral realm of the various aspects of our own life, in every aspect of our life, that all the virtues have to do with, and the various commandments. And this is the beginning of our being a steward in the most root and important sense. And then this flows out into all the other areas of life. And so again, I think we're in a very unique position that we're able to have this great richness behind our concern for all of the issues here. And it, you know, really struck me is thinking of bioethics, which fundamentally a concern for human health. It's a concern for human health that's in a context, or it's a concern for human health that recognizes that what most people mean by human health is too reductionist. It too much reduces it simply to a bodily health. And yes, that is an appropriate focus, bodily health. And maybe in a sense, it's the prime immediate focus, seems, of bioethics. But at the same time, an appropriate bioethics recognizes that human health is in the broader human context of flourishing, a teleological ordering, where everything that is lower is ordered to something higher. So if you allow me again, before then getting very concrete, I'm going to, at risk of being overly philosophical, I'm going to tell you a principle that might be a bit controversial, or the wording of it is perhaps tricky, but I'm going to go to a philosophical mentor of mine, a German 20th century Thomist by the name of Joseph Pieper. And he used a great term, I think, again, one that could be very misunderstood. He uses the word hierarchical thinking. Seems to me the notion properly understood of hierarchical thinking is foundational to all right thinking about the cosmos, about human life, about morality. And in short, what do we mean by hierarchical thinking? It means putting first things first. And that when we put first things first, everything else then will find its place. Or we know what the place of all other things are in view of how they relate to putting first things first. An example that I use when I teach this concept in class is I say, we live in a world that overemphasizes material things over spiritual things. Let's just put it very simply. And so we overemphasize bodily flourishing at the cost of understanding the centrality and indeed ultimately priority of spiritual flourishing. But lo and behold, in a great paradox, but a paradox that's rooted in a great truth, is that when you put the lower things first, not only do you lose the higher things that you should have prioritized, you also lose the lower things because they're out of place. Look at a world that is always focusing on the material. And indeed, human health, you would think in a world that has in so many ways abandoned a concern for the other world, for spiritual values, where we put so much energy into various things as regards bodily things, or another way, bodily pleasures. Look at the man, the easier example of this is the man who puts bodily pleasures first, not only loses spiritual pleasures, indeed, in the end, he loses bodily pleasures because he has put things out of order. The steward needs to learn what the priority is, what the right order is, put the first things first. And it seems to me this is the integral approach to flourishing. This is the integral approach to ecology, is we need to understand that we, especially as Christians, are in a unique position to remember the first things and put them first. I conclude that little segment by invoking scripture, because I really think that our Lord's principle here is rooted in a philosophical principle, frankly, that Plato and Aristotle saw very clearly. It's central in the Republic of Plato. You have to have first things first. Seek first the kingdom of God, and all these things will be added unto you. This could be misused, but this is wisdom. And it is ours to discern what that means and how to enact that. How do we put first things first? And in putting those first things first, do we then, in fact, discover the proper place of everything else? I say again, utterly convinced this is why Christianity is really the only approach that's going to ever get right environmentalism. Because if you simply approach environmentalism from the viewpoint of our primary concern is the health of the biological ecosystems, it's never going to work. That's not in accord with God's order. God indeed wants those natural lower things to flourish, but to flourish in a context where they have their place, in a context of human persons who understand that their relationship with God and their relationship with one another comes first. And this doesn't undermine our relationship with lower things. It gives it its context in more ultimate purpose. And indeed, then we are in a position to most properly seek the other things in view of them. So human providence then is exercised in many ways. And clearly part of God's call to us to be provident is to exercise a providence over material creation. And what I'd like to do is just focus on something that I've done some work in. I think it's super practical, how that particularly can be done in the household. Because it seems to me here, and this is where I want to get very concrete. This is a very big philosophical interest of mine. I think central to our sickness in the modern world is our loss of this most natural and primary of communities as a central place of daily human life. Honestly, we want to talk about the loss of human happiness and human health in the broad sense. Unhealthy people. I live in the country. Go, the massive suburbs right over the mountain that I'm looking out the window at here. These massive suburbs where you have countless people living in houses that are not homes or households. They're isolated from one another, and they go about their way profoundly disconnected and unhealthy in countless ways. And this can in many ways be reduced or deeply connected with the fact that they don't have a home. They don't have a household where they're connected. I love Wendell Berry's theme of health is connection. Health is connection, and there's lots of different kinds of connection. There's connection with God, which is the primary one. There's connection with one another in our household community. There's connection with neighbors in the broader community, and there's connection with the earth and the animals. All of these are connections that we need, and we are in our age disconnected from all of them. We are in an age that is characterized by disconnection. And an approach of stewardship is going to be looking to reconnect, to reestablish. And this is the great line from Wendell Berry: to seek health is to seek to reestablish connections. We need to get reconnected, and not all of these connections should be sought in a connected way, for all these connections are interconnected with one another. And this goes back to hierarchical thinking. Put each thing in its place, and you have this symphony of flourishing. And so the household is the natural context for that symphony. It's the most obvious gift that God has given us, where, talk about stewardship, talk about a model that works, talk about a model that our society has abandoned. A mother and a father who take responsibility for life in a home. There's a model that works. There's a model of stewardship. There's a model where you have two people that have every reason to take an integral approach. If they put first things first and they focus on their relationship with one another and their relationship with their children and the relationship of each of them with others, you have this wonderful kind of primordial stewardship, just as in biblical times. It's a stewardship of the household, as in the story of the prodigal son. The father of the prodigal son, he was a man of stewardship. He knew how to take care of things, and he took care of things primarily for the sake of the persons involved. And you might say his life was first of all about his sons. But because he had a broad view, he understood how that includes everything else. And I have every confidence he took very good care of his homestead and of the things that went on there, such that once upon a time, his son remembered and he looked back and he said, there are many servants in the household of my father who are flourishing right now because my daddy, he knows how to take care of people. What in the world am I doing over here? So he needed to go home. He needed to go back to a place where a mommy and a daddy are concerned about connections in a rich and broad way. And they look at life through the lens of real human flourishing. And so the home, I wrap up by saying the home is a place of connectedness among other connections. And I think, again, this is why the household is where I think a man and a woman just go to in the beautiful natural gift. It's not always going to be like this, right? But we're talking about what the beautiful archetype is that God has given us. And then when we don't have that perfectly, we do what we can. But a man and a woman where their life is fundamentally about the relationship of persons and are flourishing under the Lord, and then the beautiful way under his providence that has the richness of having all these other things brought into it. And so we're restoring a household where we have a sense of connections rooted in the ultimate connections, connectedness to the earth, and a care of your little corner of the world. And so I mean, a few suggestions, and I do this, I suggest these, and this fits with, you know, Berkman was in, and again, how these things fit together. It's a great way to work on relationships in the household, to grow your own food, right? And to take care of the earth. That's a way of connecting ourselves. So okay, I'm going to wrap up in 45 seconds here, and just a couple of my suggestions. Growing food by sustainable practices in the households, taking care of animals in an appropriate and fitting way, the way that animals can be taken care of by persons in the household, rejecting consumerism and all that goes along with it. Right? All these things are so interconnected. John Paul II's great theme of consumerism, right? That's something we can address in the household. I'm going to leave it right there. Thanks very much for your attention.
John, thank you very much for that very stimulating presentation, and in particular, the way that you brought it down to the attitudes and practical actions that one can take in the household itself. So let's open it now to John and John. John Berkman, would you like to raise anything with John Cuddeback?
Yes, I really appreciated the scriptural insights that Professor Cuddeback had. Yeah, I'm very much in agreement. And I think there's a lot of ways, a lot of complementarity between the two things that we were trying to present. And I think they come together well. And I think I would largely be interested in getting other people involved in the conversation and hearing what other insights people could bring.
Sure.
Just these huge and important issues.
Sure. And what about you, John Cuddeback? Would you like to raise anything with John Berkman?
Thank you for the opportunity. The answer is absolutely, I do. But I think that Professor Berkman's approach is a great one there, and I mean that in the sense of I've got 18 to 20 things I'd love to discuss with them right now. But let's, this is a group effort here, and I'm sure we'll have occasion to do that. And partially because we're guests, and we're here to serve you. Let's hear where the status of the discussion is in your all's minds, and see how we can work with that.
Well, thank you. You're both very generous in that. Okay, so we'll widen the discussion, and I will hand things over to Dr. Bill Sullivan.
Well, thank you very much. And I really appreciate really setting out both the very high level way of even thinking about these issues and also very concrete and practical advice regarding things. So this remaining time is actually to just probe further on, both what those topics I just mentioned, kind of the big ways of thinking about things, and also, very practical things. And I noticed if people can just check the chat, Mary Kate Gorky has just put in some instructions about how people can pose questions either through the chat, and we're kind of organizing those questions so that we're not jumping too much from topic to topic. And then also, if people would like to pose a question, they can also unmute and just pose it directly to one or both speakers. So typically, we like to kind of, I think, begin kind of big and then go down. And I think that has been the pattern that's been set out for us. And so both of you actually began by talking about what's the goal. And it is interesting to me that there is this big goal, which I would say is the macro perspective that I think, John, you raised, John Cuddeback, that it is actually relational, and it's getting these relations right. And then I think John Berkman provided the goal for how we should be thinking about this whole issue of our use of food and within this broader scope of things. So just to begin with that, one little tiny thing is, are we talking about food in relation to ecosystem or systems? John Berkman.
Sure. Well, absolutely, ecosystems. I mean, there are many, many different ecosystems. I mean, I suppose you could speak of the planet as one, but in terms of actually how we understand the flourishing of ecosystems, there are many, many, many different ecosystems in different places, in different ways they can be configured. Sometimes they're completely separate, sometimes they're overlapping. But yes, I would definitely see it in the plural. And also just to add, just to emphasize your point following on John Cuddeback's point, Laudato Si, the most common term that just is everywhere in Laudato Si is everything is related and relationality. And there's about 8 variants of that term sprinkled throughout Laudato Si. So I certainly want to emphasize and affirm that point, which I did not highlight nearly as much and was a lack in what I was trying to say, because that's clearly underlying so much of what I was trying to articulate.
And maybe John Cuddeback, was I correct in this interpretation that this is the big picture is relational, and that's where the fundamental thinking needs to begin? Oh, you're just on mute, I think.
Sorry about that. I think so. And so here's the thing. Yes, and how about if I push it forward a little bit, and I've been interested in Professor Berkman, kind of drawing you out on this, on the how to relate to animals, is so central, and it's such a delicate question. And maybe I should just say, we'll give ourselves permission if we end up having a slightly different emphasis or whatever. We'll be talking through and trying to understand one another. I would maybe if you don't mind, William, in view of your question there, maybe I would throw this out there. If we take a very concrete, practical approach, kind of what are we most going to be encouraging people to do? This just struck me. I think there's much to be said for, here's a model I like. Kind of going back to household. So it's about relations, but there's a hierarchy of relations. It's first of all about your relations with other people, and that the relationships between persons have a priority over our relationships with anything else. And of course, among people, then if we say there's the uncreated relationship and the created, and then with other creatures, and our relationship with, say, non-rational animals needs to be properly integrated into that. But as I think about here, then getting very concrete, what might move people to change their eating habits? Boy, am I in agreement with Professor Berkman that the industrial model of meat production is a catastrophe. I mean, it's a catastrophe in so many ways. Something I'm a part of and I see with my own eyes, it seems to me is a good sign for health is, and there's all different names for, do you call it slow food? Do you call it sustainable agriculture? The local movement, the community supported agriculture, getting to know your farmers. So it seems to me that there's already a movement afoot that we want to get behind and bolster and give more direction. And that is people being more concerned about the quality of their food and including the source of it. How has it been produced? How are the animals being treated? But if you have more people involved in that, growing it themselves, / hurting it themselves, getting in touch with others who are, it seems to be, this is something that in the context of kind of very local, as part of your life as a family, as a life, whatever form exactly your household is, this is something that can immediately move people. Change of heart, yes, I need to do that here. Changing the macro thing, kind of convincing big business is going to keep pushing big agriculture, right? They're going to be hard to stop directly, but the grassroots, giving them a vision of this is what you can do in your home, just seems to me there's much to be said for. This is where we can start to change how people are living. I'd be interested to hear what Professor Berkman thinks about that.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that, that part of the change of our way of seeing is to become far more engaged with the sources of our food, come to appreciate it more directly, you know, from when it actually comes, you know, from the ground to our table. You know, as Wendell Berry once said, you know, agribusiness, if possible, they would love to have a tube going from the factory directly to our stomach and to take over every value added possibility that they can. And I think that is absolutely not the kind of relationship we should be seeking to have with the fruits of creation that we thank God for in the Eucharist. And to really seek to understand that and engage in the practices that help us to come to see God's providential goodness in everything that is created, that we are able to use.
Thank you for that. Just another kind of big question that relates to goals. And you picked up on this word, John, and I think had a critical comment about this term sustainable, that's actually from a Christian point of view, not sufficient. Do you want to expand on that a bit? And I'd also like to hear John Cuddeback's view about, yeah, what is, you know, everybody's talking about, let's just survive, right? It seems that's what sustainable means, I would think. And it could be that the agro, you know, industry, all they have to do is make sure that the, you know, carbon balance is a little better. But is that what we're talking about here?
Right. I again, because and I think Professor Cuddeback and I very much agree that as Thomists, really what we're interested in is the flourishing of all creatures in relationship to God. For humans, that's beatitude, ultimately in friendship with God. Sustainability is not ultimately, although it's obviously a much better goal than what has been the goal previously, which is basically earthly destruction by other means. It's certainly an improvement, but I think so often sustainability is a sophisticated form of anthropocentrism. It's basically enlightened self-interest by human beings. And, the two things that Pope Francis goes after most aggressively in, I think it's the second chapter of Laudato Si', maybe the third one, it's the third one, are this kind of technocratic paradigm and what he calls anthropocentrism, thinking that everything just revolves around us, that everything else that God has created is simply the backdrop for the stage in which we dance around on. And Pope Francis is trying to say that's not the way things are or the way things should be. So, I mean, if sustainability is really ordered to all of creation, then I think we can buy into that. But even then, I think we don't want it just to be able to survive. We want it to be able to flourish.
And John Cuddeback, anything to add to that?
I completely agree, and I like the points of it's absolutely about more survival, or we might say, why? It's always about the end. It's always about the final cause. Right? What's the point? Why should I be most concerned about having a sustainable situation? I mean, as Professor Berkman said, we're all for sustainability. Because whatever we're doing should be something that is sustainable, but one way of kind of amplifying this, sustainable unto what end? Up to this point, there has been this very self-centered view that has just kind of gathered things unto ourselves. And again, isn't this fundamental? This is why our view towards these things that we're talking about is always connected to the more primordial moral dispositions. The man who is selfish, right? Consumerism didn't come from nowhere, right? It comes from the selfish human heart that's willing to use not only animals, plants, the world around it, other people in a kind of hedonistic way. And so we end up greed, hedonism go very much together. So we need a much richer view. At some point, and this might not be the way to go right now, I would be interested, but I'm going to completely defer to you all on Professor Berkman raised rightly the question of anthropocentrism. And I think that's a really important question, because the traditional view of the West could be accused of anthropocentrism. What is guilty of that or not, I think, does have to be sorted out. Particularly, we'd have to really be careful about that, because one of the main features of many of the movements around us is one that does not sufficiently recognize the human difference. So how can we avoid the evil that is legitimately criticized as an anthropocentrism, while at the same time not making the fundamental mistake of missing the human difference, and that there is a natural and obvious centrality of the human over the non-human.
So one final question, I guess, just before we move from goals to sort of means, is this broader context of the world situation. And kind of an important thinker in this line, and this was 12 years ago, Jamie Harvey kind of was talking about kind of this, what's happening with ecology, a part of which is climate change. And the thing that he said was most important for him, the one word, is time. Time is running out. And he said that 12 years ago. And I think what I'm hearing is that the trend is not even improving. It's getting worse in terms of this food issue. And so it does, I guess the question is, in terms of turning things around, what kind of time frame are we talking about? Because that will influence the means.
That's a huge question, and I have to confess, I'm not good on how to think about our time frameworks. I wish I could say more about that, and I need to think more about that and read up on it more. But I think there's already some pretty significant, maybe significant irreversible changes that are already going on and are going to go on, and I don't.
Hard to bring species back, for instance.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. And John Cuddeback, any thought about that? Is it like our generation, the next few generations?
Well, William, I find myself saying, well, if the issue, pardon me for being so stubbornly, maybe obtusely philosophical, or maybe it's not appropriate even to call it philosophical, but I find myself even there saying, if the question is time, still, what's the end? What are we most worried about? May I be a little bit provocative?
Yeah, well, just sustainable, not even flourishing.
Yeah, well, I mean, who knows, right? I mean, at the end of the day, what are we? I said, what are Catholic bioethicists going to be most focusing our attention on? And pick me up and chuck me out the window. Defenestrate me if that's fitting. But I find myself inclined to say, I'm very concerned about the extremely concerned about the increasing degradation of the environment. That's not what I'm most concerned about. I'm most concerned about the lack of human flourishing, which is related, but it's not the same thing. And so I think, when someone says their main concern is time, I'm not sure that person and I are being concerned about the same thing, right? And not so. It pushes us back to, and what are we most going after? What are we most trying to preserve? And I think that we should always kind of be first focusing on here. I think is the appropriate emphasis of the human difference. We need to be calling people to conversion, right? I mean, this is certainly the way Laudato Si ends. To a conversion that fundamentally is a kind of a putting first things first. And I think to some extent that conversion is not going to be a conversion about how we treat the world. It's going to be a conversion of what's most important in life, of putting first things first. If we were being good Christians, the environment would follow, if I may be so bold.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I don't know if I might be missing something there.
No, that was very helpful. I think now we can shift to kind of the means. What are the sort of options to think about? And in the kind of scientific world, it's called implementation science. Like, how do you actually kind of do an analysis of what are the realistic opportunities and the barriers? And for even like this issue of moving to a plant-based diet. And, John Berkman, I think, raised two very big, I would call them barriers. And that's sort of, a Western commitment to kind of a technological imperative or paradigm that invades so much of even healthcare, but also the agri industry. And then there's the economics. And I think, John Berkman, you also mentioned that as sort of a barrier, because there are people that are quite committed to the status quo. And they might, and I think in Laudato Si, it's even highlighted how important rethinking the economics in order to make these changes. So, I mean, these are pretty huge barriers when you think about implementing any kind of change to get this public health issue kind of a plan for the planet. Any comment on that? Maybe I'll begin with John Berkman, since you highlighted those two big barriers. Or maybe John Cuddeback.
And again, I love to hear what anyone else is thinking here, and John might and of course Professor Berkman follow up there. Here's a quick reflection. I'm trying to be very strategic. I would just kind of raise this question in the name of discussion. Which is going to be more, which is a more practical approach? Promoting moving from animal-based to plant-based, or promoting moving from our current situation to a stewardship model? And this is where, I mean, for me, and this is partially just coming to experience the community in which I live, I am constantly pushing people to think differently about what they eat, especially meat. Part of how we address that is one of my former students is now moving into being a full-time producer in a way that is very, I think, takes wonderful care of his chickens. He is producing chickens in a beautiful way that now is I think a very stewardship-based one. And so to go to people and Professor Berkman, again, I ask this in just a fraternal way of wanting to think with you. I think to say to people, we need to move to a plant-based, concretely, what does that mean to me? Is that saying to me, I need to stop eating meat? If that's what people are hearing versus they're hearing, I need to be much more careful, much more reflective, and much more selective about what meat I eat. Is that the point, or how where's the rubber meet the road?
Should I respond to that?
Yeah,
Yes.
I'd love to hear your thought on that.
Oh, sure.
John.
Well, I think particularly in the North American context, where the vast majority of animal products are produced in factory farms, which I think is simply wicked, because of the routinization of massive animal cruelty that goes on, as well as the incredible environmental problems with such operations, and the use of antibiotics, et cetera, a whole range of reasons. I would be ecstatic if people simply absolutely refuse to eat any meat that's factory farmed. In other words, if you don't know where it comes from, it's almost certainly factory farmed. So unless you know what, if you just refuse to eat anything that's factory farmed that you don't know where it comes from, I think that would be a massive improvement. Question, of course, if that happens, then meat will become far more expensive. And still, if the whole society wants to continue to consume it at current rates, the use of agricultural land, the use of plant-based products to feed that, animal protein is far, far less efficient. And it's really not clear that even if the production of such animal protein showed far greater welfare to the animals, there's no way we as a planet, as an entire planet, could sustain, even with reasonable animal welfare, the consumption of animals that we in the West take for granted, and the planet survive. So it's always going to have to involve the have or have nots, unless everybody massively reduces their animal protein intake.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the reality is now in the modern West, there's really no need for anybody to eat animal products. The alternatives are there. They're cheap, they're tasty. I recognize there's certain cultural traditions that will be upset, or for some people, certain notions of masculinity that somehow can't be addressed adequately without killing and eating animals. But leaving those aside, I just see all the advantages of moving away from that. And I don't frankly see any significant advantages to retaining it. And now I'm speaking specifically in the West and in North America. Other cultures, other countries, you have to take them case by case, where it becomes much more complicated. So again, as I said in my presentation, you have to take these individual situations. But I think in the North American context, leaving aside the Arctic perhaps, well, just say with Canada and the United States, I think all the advantages and all the witness that could be involved in making, for many people, would be a big sacrifice, would be a real witness to concern for our planet, concern for animal welfare, and just clearly a witness to taking, Laudato Si seriously in the way that I think Pope Francis is calling to, and I think he's right to.
Right. Okay, so I'm going to just raise two more questions. The first was a question from Andrew McGorman, and his question is, what can an Indigenous perspective contribute to what was described as kind of this unique place of Christians on these issues? And in fact, for people's information, we're going to have a subsequent webinar on this very topic. Maybe I'll pose this to John Cuddeback, because you kind of mentioned the sure. Christian has sure. has all the ducks lined up, right?
Right. It is great issue. And so allow me to say, in my saying that, I do not imply exclusively. I do think that Christianity has the ultimate view in terms of the truth of salvation through Christ, and which what does that, and that includes in it a whole new, as for instance Professor Berkman pointed out, a Eucharistic approach. There's some unique things there that absolutely are unique gifts that God has revealed, that we are the unworthy benefactors of. At the same time, I think it's absolutely critical to see where, you can say from a Thomistic perspective, the light of natural reason is at work. And there's so much that can be learned from people that have lived in various and sundry ways by the light of natural reason. And so, to emphasize that we have a unique position as Christians, I take that as a kind of a unique obligation to be particularly stepping up and be seeing the gift that we have there. And it's not in any way in excluding the insights of the other traditions here. And I would, if I might, just be pushing this great thing with Professor Berkman, I would say, part of the thing that I think that Indigenous peoples can show us is how meat can be raised well, right? I just think that needs to be part of, and I'm sure it's a part of a time. And we're speaking in your directing the North American context, got it. But of course, Indigenous peoples here, right, in their relationship with various and sundry kinds of meat. So I just think that's going to be a very practical and important strategic aspect of what are we saying to people? Can we say to them, particularly given, because I do think, and I know Professor Berkman, you will agree with this, it just hasn't been noted, factory farming of plant-based things is awful, right? I mean, we have poisons of all kinds that are going on in the widespread production of plant proteins and so forth. The great emphasis of soy. What is that doing? And so I just to just be putting on the airwaves a kind of primacy of the stewardship approach, and this can be plant and animal based. Clearly, we have too much of an emphasis of the animal. But how can you still do animals right? That comes to mind when you think of the Indigenous peoples, because Indigenous peoples almost universally had a rather significant place for the meat there. So how can we do that right? I just think needs to be an ongoing question.
That's excellent. So I think that I'm going to turn things back to Bernadette to kind of wrap up, and just to kind of thank myself, our speakers, especially the strategic questions, I think are very important. And it strikes me that something that just came to my mind, you know, there's this economic analysis that is supply demand. And really, I think the strategic suggestion that I heard is work on the demand side, right? If people stop, you know, are selective and so on, that will affect that economic system. So thank you very much for all your great contributions. And back to you, Bernadette.
Well, Bill, thank you. I too want to say to Professor Berkman, whom I've been calling John, and Professor Cuddeback, who I've been calling John in my vulgar Australian way. Thank you very much. Look, it's been, I think these are, we are breaking new ground for us bioethicists in trying to address these questions. And I think they are really very difficult for us. But you've thrown to us a lot of very useful things. We went from some very practical reasons why we should reject meat-based diets, for climate reasons, in order to eliminate the cruelty of factory farmers, and then for reasons to do with human health. We went from that to a much more theoretical discussion about, well, what's the goal of our thinking and our efforts when we're trying to address an ethical ecology? And a couple of candidates were put up. Sustainability, a good thing, but no. The flourishing of all forms of life, human, non-human, animal, and the environment, yes. But even better, relatedness between these forms of life. And then we went on to, Bill's question was, well, by what means? And we jumped immediately to the obstacles, as we have discussed in Laudato Si, the technological mindset and the economic mindset. But the means, well, John Cuddeback said, put first things first. And embedded in that idea was an invitation to craft a sound anthropocentrism. And it'd be good if I could start by pronouncing that word, but it is very late at night. It's midnight in Sydney, so that's my excuse. But in all of this, some concepts keep coming back that demand clarity. Stewardship, this unpronounceable one, anthropocentrism. And John Cuddeback has said, no, you really need to think about providence and the provident human being. So I think we are greatly in your debt today, and thank you very much for what you've done for us. What I now want to do is just to say that this has been the third of 5 webinars. The next one will be, in fact, next week. And the title is Thinking and Acting Across Disciplines. And we will have 3 speakers, 2 sisters, Sister Damian Savino and Sister Raffaella Petrini, who are both Franciscan Sisters of the Eucharist, and Father Jerry Whalen, SJ. And our project will be to discuss what's needed by way of interdisciplinary collaboration to advance bioethical thinking on One Health. Sister Savino is an environmental engineer, and Sister Petrini, who's a social and political scientist, will use what is apparently a social ecological resilience theory to articulate the idea of One Health and the Catholic conception of caring for creation. and Father Jerry will offer insights on interdisciplinary research from his collaboration as a theologian with environmental scientists. Now, all this is by way of preparation for our in-person colloquium in Rome in June on the subject matter at Domus Australia, there in the city of Rome. And our ultimate aim is to produce a consensus statement and some particular academic papers that will be of use to our colleagues in bioethics on this, well, development from our topic last year, which was ethics in a pandemic, which took us from considerations of the health of the individual, the doctor-patient relationship, to a wider conception of health in the sense of public health, and now further to an ecological conception of health. So what I want to do is to bring this session to a close. Thank our speakers very much and our audience, and I hope that we will see everyone this time next week. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It's been a
Thank
pleasure
you.
to be
Great
part
being
of
with
this.
you.
Thank you.